Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Matiwos natural processed Ethiopia from September Coffee Company. And there's the bag right there. And September, based out of Ottawa, Ontario, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel quite a bit over the last few years, including our recent review of the Bekele Kachare, a different natural processed Ethiopian coffee. And I bring up that review largely due to the fact that we were reviewing these two natural Ethiopian coffees side by side for a little bit. In addition to that, I mentioned at the end of that review that I would be reserving a lot of my feelings and opinions on that coffee until we finished reviewing this one. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how these two Ethiopian coffees compared, as this right here is day 75. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This one is one of September's extra light offerings. And even with this one being on the more processed side of things, you can certainly tell that it skews heavily in that direction of being on the lighter side of things. That being said, I feel like I've had extra light coffees from September in the past that have been maybe a little bit lighter than this one, as I think the processing was a little bit at play with this coffee, as there's only so light you can go with something that is processed in this manner. That being said, I can't quite recall any other Canadian coffee roasters that might be anywhere near on par as the lightness that this coffee does offer. So all of this is to say that this coffee is still on the very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 45, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the coffee is interestingly a bit more red berry forward than the non-extra light version of this coffee. And once again, to put this in context, I did receive a sample of the standard profile of this coffee, and I was very impressed with the first try of that one, as it did come out a bit more blue forward relative to either this one or our initial experience of the Bekele Kachare. Truth be told, it was the best first impression I had had of any of the three natural processed Ethiopian coffees we had, that Bekele Kachare and the standard and extra light version of this coffee as well. That being said, it still maintained a good level of cleanliness, but a notably different base with a slight bit of graininess and plenty of the darker berry attributes, but even then it did skew a little bit more on the red fruit side of things than either of the other two coffees. Day 48 through the Chemex, and the coffee does come out slightly more red fruit forward yet again, especially relative to the non-extra light version of this coffee, with it continuing to remain on the red berry side of things, but in a slightly different tone, as there's less graininess this time around, better clarity, and it's relatively intense as expected going into it. We move on to day 51 as we opted for the April brewer, and the coffee does have some pretty prominent berry notes once again, very much in line with the listed grape aspects as it's presented in a slightly heavy sense. And truth be told, when I purchased this coffee, I purchased it with the idea in mind of comparing and contrasting it to the Matiwos that we had reviewed from Bots, which is another Matiwos that I didn't necessarily have the best impression of overall, as there are some other natural processed Ethiopian coffees I've enjoyed this year a bit more than either of those. Still a bit of fermentiness and a surprisingly high level of brightness, and the biggest takeaway I had on this day, especially given that it was a slightly lower extraction adjustment for that coffee, was that it still just came out very bright, so it's a lot brighter than expected. I think one of the notes they have listed on here for this coffee is vibrant, which makes a lot of sense. We move on to day 54 as we opted for the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, higher temperatures, lower concentration, more fine grind, and it is a slightly mixed experience this time around as it's offering a better level of clarity, but the coffee really opens up a lot more as it does cool down. The profile still seems to skew a bit more on the red berry side of things, so that's where the mixed impression comes about, mostly because I was hoping that this coffee at some point would transition into maybe a little bit more of a blue tone to it. Day 57 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this is the best the coffee has been to this point, as there's nice clarity and overall intensity for this one, as it does continue to remain on the darker berry side of things, especially this time around a little bit more of a blueberry compote sense to it. A bit of brightness once again with a sweet, lingering, lasting finish, fully expected given the intensity of this one. We move on to day 60 as we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and it's the best it's been to this point as it has become cleaner each time we brew it. And that's really what I was hoping for with this coffee, given that the first couple of tries I had with the standard version of this coffee was cleaner than anything we had experienced up to this point with this coffee, which in theory, the entire reason for the profile of this one is that it should be perhaps a little bit cleaner. Once again, they even list on their website that you're sacrificing maybe an initial level of cleanliness for it, like for this coffee, an initial level of intensity, but it's kind of rewarded at the back end with better cleanliness, clarity, but that's not necessarily what I was experiencing up to this point. Honestly, it was the standard version of this coffee that was turning out both cleaner and more intense in general. So finally having the coffee skew in this direction was what I've been waiting for to happen. Still plenty of the darker berry aspects in a cleaner sense. Red fruits are also present, but this time notably cleaner as the fermentiness is palatable. And I do have to say this is the first time I found it to be a bit more palatable, as up to this point it was perhaps just a bit more fermenty than I would have liked. Day 63 through the Chemex, and the coffee is holding up well for this brew method. Oftentimes it doesn't really work that well, especially for a coffee that's processed like this and this light of a profile, but it still worked with nice clarity and a notably defined red berry feel to it while lacking that intense fermentiness. Brightness does continue to remain an ever-present quality to it with a nicely balanced level of sweetness. Day 66. Final notes we have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and this coffee was slightly inconsistent as it's not quite as good as the previous V60 day, this time offering a slight bit more fermentiness in the red fruit cocktail-like sense, but it is made up for with a lovely bit of peachiness that's shining through, and there's that slight bit of potential that I said maybe there's a little bit more depth to this coffee that I haven't necessarily unraveled yet to this point, but for the most part it's been very dominant and a very pronounced violet floral component to it as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those. We'll start with the finish and sweetness both at that level 4. I always say when it comes to more processed coffees, as long as we're not reaching level 5 territory, then it's certainly not too overbearing. That being said, the sweetness is obviously going to be very high on this coffee, but it certainly didn't pass that threshold of being too intense, as the berry qualities do tend to be the most dominant characteristic to them. And given that this coffee does have that lingering bright finish to it, I think that's probably a better way to describe it, is the finish turns out a little bit more bright than I would even say berry-like, given that the brightness just really seems to have a long-lasting finish to it. So if anything, I could discuss those top 3 things together, as it does have plenty of sweetness to it, fully expected, but the finish mostly does skew in the brighter side of things, as the acidity does score there at the level 4. And I've always said in the past that it's not the most important thing to me. I feel like once a coffee actually does lack acidity, as some of the decaf coffees we've reviewed has, that's when I realize what I'm actually missing out on. But in this case, I said I could probably do without. If anything, I feel like it might be slightly hindering my overall experience with this coffee, given that it's just adding another layer to a coffee that at times isn't always the best balanced, given that there's even more of this coffee just skewing heavily in a direction that I have mixed impressions of in general. Florality, level 4. I mentioned towards the end that there's a very strong, intense violet-like feel, that kind of classic perfumey natural Ethiopian florality to it, and that's pronounced and pretty prominent throughout the entirety of this one, so not really surprising that scored there at the level 4. Berry fruit, level 4. And this coffee definitely had plenty of the red berry tones to it, and I can't quite recall, I think grape is one of the primary notes that they do have listed on here, but it did remind me a fair bit of the Matiwos that we had from Bots, which was certainly skewing a lot more on the red fruit side of things. They had stuff like a red cocktail, I want to say, and a lot of red berries, strawberries I think was one of the big ones on there, and that's honestly much more of what I was getting from this coffee as opposed to maybe some of the darker blueberry tones to it that I'd experienced from the standard version of this coffee. So I can't necessarily explain that. I think it just goes to show that sometimes maybe a standard version of a coffee, especially when it comes to a natural coffee, can be a little better than an extra light version of it. A couple of level 3s. We will start with the citrus fruit, level 3. I feel like that's a little bit more of a generic citric quality to it. It's not something I could necessarily pinpoint, but I felt the need to put it there given that the brightness was as high as it was. We move on to the stone fruit there at the level 3 mark. I mentioned at the end I was experiencing a slight bit of peachiness poking through, and I wish I could have experienced a lot more of that within this coffee because I feel like it gave it just a bit more depth. But given that we made this tasting wheel when I was experiencing that on the cool down, it's something that I did want to notate within this tasting wheel. And then body, level 2, want to discuss that briefly, as I think maybe it's a result of us brewing this one with the Chemex, though truth be told, it didn't necessarily have the most amount of body for the entirety of the time that we were consuming this one. So level 2, probably where I was going to put it regardless. And then that takes us into the final and most important thing we're discussing in this tasting wheel, cleanliness, level 3. And I got some brews of this coffee with the standard version that I could say I could justify there at the level 4 mark. But at no time with this coffee was I ever able to justify a level 4, mostly because it was held back by the fermentiness. The graininess did seem to dissipate with a little bit more time, but even then the definition to a lot of the characteristics in this coffee weren't quite to the extent that I feel like could make up for the mintiness and the processing in general of this coffee. So level 3 is where I put it. Even then, I would say maybe slightly cleaner than the average natural processed Ethiopian coffee, but that's the best direction I can put it. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like it's been relatively negative compared to the non-extra light version of this coffee, and I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the case, because the last brew I had of the standard version of this coffee did seem to taper off ever so slightly, where I feel like this coffee is still improving, and I feel like that's where there's maybe a little bit of frustration with this coffee. I think it's still going to get better, and given that you have to wait till maybe like a day 70 mark to kind of see this coffee even out and become a little bit more stable, a little bit more clean, can be a little tricky, especially if you don't necessarily have the patience or time to wait for a coffee to really go in that direction. The standard version of this coffee really set the bar extremely high for this extra light version, and for that reason, this coffee took so long to start to live up to even the baseline experience that I had from that standard version, that for me, it honestly just made much more sense if I would have purchased the standard version, had the review done at the same time that I had the Bekele Kachara, and I really could have had maybe a better comparison of those two coffees, because I still feel like it's a to be continued. I don't know if this one was ever going to be better than the Bekele Kachara or even the standard version of this Matiwos, but I'm just kind of left wondering how it's going to turn out from here, and I have maybe one brew of this coffee left to see how that might turn out, but basically leaves it ended up as a mystery. And as a result, I think the only thing I can do now is compare the Bekele Kachara and the standard version of the Matiwos. And what's happened with the Bekele Kachara is that one has really improved since I finished recording that review, and that's a little frustrating because that coffee is one that I would justify at the level 4. And I think at the end of the day, what I can say is the Bekele Kachara is my clear favorite of any of the 3 versions of these natural processed Ethiopian coffees that we've had. I think that one's a true standout and one of my favorite natural processed Ethiopian coffees we've had over the last couple of years. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to: if you're going for the extra light version of this coffee, somebody that has a lot of patience, because this coffee does reward a lot more patience, as it does seem to kind of clean up. It does seem to offer better definition, better structure. It does have a lot of brightness, so that's another thing that I must focus on with this coffee. It's not too heavy, it's not too overbearing. It does skew a little bit more on the red fruit side of things. So all of those are very important factors of this one, but you are rewarded given that it does have a little bit more cleanliness for a natural processed Ethiopian coffee in general. And I certainly enjoyed it a bit more than the one that we had from Bots as well. So all of those are the positives that I experienced from this coffee, even if at times it felt a little frustrating. I think that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Matiwos Natural Processed Ethiopia from September Coffee Company. Thank you for watching.